Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And today we're going to talk about all kinds of things like cannabis, alcohol, raw milk, Doritos, I don't know, stuff you could put in your body. But
that sounds so good.
Sure, yeah, we'll be sure to hit everybody's vice of choice here as we go along. But Cameron, interesting times we're living in, because I just saw a statistic that now in the United States, there are more daily cannabis users than daily alcohol consumers. Which, if you were to scroll back even 10 years, and that was true, maybe nobody would admit it at that point, but that's a pretty radical shift, I think, in our culture, to think about there being more people using cannabis daily than alcohol daily. That's a change. And I think even talking to healthcare providers and stuff, people that I know that are, friends, they would say, yeah, alcohol has kind of lost its place as the kingpin of the major forms of addiction and substance abuse. And that can be all across the spectrum, from whatever opioids or whatever else is going on. But I want to, pick your brain a little bit about some of the shifting things. So definitely younger generation has dialed back on alcohol a lot. And then this is in the news again, because the Agricultural Health and Human Services Department in Washington, D.C. is working on updated guidelines for alcohol consumption. And for the first time in history, there's a consideration that they would separate out the alcohol recommendations from the federal dietary guidelines, which, okay, let's be honest here. Nobody probably really pays too much attention to the federal dietary guidelines, and hasn't for some time. And the whole thing is easily laughable, from you remember you weren't supposed to eat eggs for a while. That thing seems to ebb and flow. Marion Nestle, not related to Nestle Food Company, wrote an interesting book called Food Politics. As the only tenured professor of nutrition in the United States that isn't personally sponsored by a food corporation, she has some interesting things to say, saying that basically the food pyramid is a paid-for platform as a marketing ploy. But however cynical you want to get about that, we're thinking now of separating this out so that there is an alcohol consumption guideline. Canada just changed theirs. Canada had previously said that 15 drinks per week for a man and 10 per week for a woman was considered to be okay as far as health standards go. They have now lowered that down to 2 per week, which is a significant reduction, right. 15 to 2. And the World Health Organization is now saying that there is no amount of alcohol that is healthy at all. And that, you can find those studies that say people who drink live longer. And they're like, yeah, there's some pretty significant flaws in the process there. So, hey, you want to talk about cultural change? This would be one of those. What are you seeing on your end as it relates to let's talk first about a decrease in alcohol consumption and then an increase in some other things. Take it from there.
Yeah, so one of the articles I came across that corroborates what you're saying was from people who operate concert venues expressing frustration because younger people are not buying alcohol. And that's a significant portion of their sales. I think for a long time, there's been a growing recognition of the deleterious health effects of alcohol. And that has finally come home to roost. I would say, Nathan, overall right now, we talk a lot about some of the lamentable features of our culture. So it makes me happy to highlight some of the good trends that I think are happening right now. And one of them is there's a little bit more of a holistic emphasis on physical health, but not just your physical well-being, but your overall mental health, your whole state of mind. Now, we can laugh off some of the phrases that come along with this. Self-care. I'm not a fan of the phrase self-care myself. Or, another one is mindfulness. I know we can roll our eyes, but part of what people are getting at with all of this is they're saying, look, it's about the quality of your life as well. And if you want longevity and quality, you're going to have to incorporate some more healthy practices. And so for a long time, because from that standpoint, there's really not too much to recommend alcohol. It's unbelievably unhealthy for you. It tends to sponsor all sorts of destructive behavior. We can talk a little bit more about that. But Nathan, you and I were talking about some of the studies behind the scenes that have been, that basically link excessive alcohol usage with all sorts of aberrant social behavior. I don't think there's anything even remotely surprising about that. But
well, that's the thing. Like we all
true.
Anecdotally, even without like, it doesn't take a PhD
that.
to know that you have an uncle who probably drinks too much and doesn't think that he does, and it's ruining his life. Like, I mean,
and
every
not
American,
just his life.
Well, right. Yeah.
I mean,
I don't have an uncle doing that right now, by the way, but just be clear.
Right.
But I'm just saying, we all have friends, coworkers, extended family, people we go to church with. In fact, the only people who don't think there's a deleterious effect to it are the people who are becoming increasingly dependent on it. And so there's a user bias that's baked right into it, sadly.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a growing recognition of the health effects or defects of alcohol. There's a growing emphasis on overall physical health. Now, I say that, and I'm fully aware that still one of the number one leading causes of death in America remains heart disease, and we still lead the world in obesity. So, but I do think, we are seeing some real challenges to those trends, which is good. So I think that's happening as well. Now, so I've highlighted some sunny stuff, but it's not all sunshine and roses here. The other reason a lot of those young people are not, and we could push into some of the other stuff we were going to talk about, Nathan, but the other reason young people in particular aren't buying alcohol at concert venues is because they're taking their drugs at home before they go to the venue, usually in the form of edibles or something like that, which is legal. It's way easier. It's a way more controlled way to to go about ingesting these substances. No smoke. Yeah, no smoke. Well, and actually, that's you mentioned smoke. So that the other interesting thing to bring in here, you haven't mentioned cigarettes or tobacco.
Oh, right. Yeah, we didn't get that one going.
On the one hand, there may be a decline in tobacco usage in traditional tobacco, the good old fashioned tobacco of my day. But now, of course, vaping is unbelievably popular. And, you talk about there's considerably less of a smell associated with it. There is a little bit of an odor, but it's not nearly as strong. It's easier to conceal. It's no better for you, but nevertheless, it's somehow managed to ride in on a wave of supposed, publicity that says it's a little bit better. This is a viable alternative. It really isn't, but nevertheless, I think plenty of people still believe it is. I've talked with people myself, Nathan, who think that their vape pen is a good alternative to a pack of Marlboros, and that's been an interesting conversation. So, I mean, there are new technologies emerging that are replacing some of our older forms of addiction. So in some ways, there are healthy trends where we're pushing past some of the stuff. In other ways, we're just replacing them with new stuff.
Well, but this is also the vision of, if you think of classic science fiction, you have Soma, you have the mood dialer machine in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, where you can just like punch in like a 3-digit code to set your mood. And including the one, my favorite one. So this is the science fiction novel that's the prerequisite to, I guess this is Blade Runner's based off this. I haven't seen Blade Runner, but I read the book. Is you can set your mood to make you want to watch TV even if you don't like what's on there, which I think is like the ultimate hilarity of like success of when you can dial your own mood in to make you want to do something that you don't want to do. So there has, I mean, this is a promise that's out there. Yeah.
No, people do that. That's why people take drugs before they watch something or listen to something sometimes. That means you've come to a place where your senses are a little bit dulled or you're a little desensitized. So you take a little something to enhance the experience for you and enjoy it more. I'm just pausing to say that Philip K. Dick is giving us something that we already do. He's showing you a novel piece of technology, but science fiction, when it's done really well, so often shows us how we live now through futuristic visions. That's one of the paradoxes of great science fiction. Yeah. End side note.
Okay. Well, hey, let's keep going on the legal stuff here. So where does caffeine play into this? We'll let the user figure that out. Michael Pollan,
I'm a caffeine user. Yes.
He came out with a book two or 3 years ago with a book saying that caffeine is a way more powerful. Some of you know him from Omnivore's Dilemma and other writing on food and policy and politics, but caffeine's powerful. Sugar, absolutely. I mean, so there's,
Very powerful.
I
Yep.
think we have this tendency to want to go like, the whole thing of like, choose your edible to, choose your mood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but we pretty much do that with food too. I mean, not to the same. So there is a difference there.
100%.
But I'm saying that the desire and the cravings, and this odd thing that all of them are elements that we start off thinking that we're using that then end up controlling us.
Mm-hmm.
And so the loss of freedom, and then the loss of freedom in choosing our mood seems to always be where these things tend to go. So yeah, I just wanted to broaden the net there to make sure that there was nobody listening who wasn't like, well, I don't do any of those things. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk about Oreos or steak.
Yes.
I don't know. Like anything can be.
Well, exactly. Well, let's use denominational headings because this is always fun to do. So I'm Presbyterian. If you've got your TOL bingo card out, there it is. There's a reference to Presbyterianism. You're Presbyterian, you've had a hard day. You got a glass of scotch waiting for you at the end of the night. You're Baptist, you've had a hard day. You got a bag of Doritos waiting for you at the end of the day, or a casserole or something like that. I mean, now one of these is a little bit maybe technically more harmful for your liver, for instance, than the other, but notice how we're using these substances both in a very psychologically complex way. And we have, of course, very psychologically complex relationships with whatever we're ingesting usually. And most of us, when we're honest with ourselves, we have a tendency to be mood eaters. That's instilled in, basically the culture around you will reinforce that for you over and over again, rather than having a relationship with food where you're the one truly in control. I mean, again, incidentally, this is why a spiritual discipline like fasting, for instance, there are many reasons to fast. The most important really is to bring you closer to hearing your Lord and to being content even when you don't get what you want. But certainly another helpful byproduct of fasting is that you have a relationship with food or whatever item you're fasting from where you're the one in control. You are the one calling the shots. This is why, Paul says, I buffet the body and make it my slave. And so, but if food is,
you punched your TOL bingo card there. So let me throw one in here. So this is a little bit of an edgy quote from Grandpa, but so throw a little Grandpa Rittenhouse on here. So he said, if self-control is part of the fruit of the Spirit, is there such a thing as an overweight Pentecostal? Mm-hmm. Which, that one stings a little, but
that's a spicy take from Grandpa.
it's a spicy way to make us think back, though, to I think the core of what you're saying there is that are we ultimately talking about self-control in all categories?
What I think is happening here, Nathan, is not a difference in kind, but a difference in degree in our culture right now. Addiction has been a problem in the U.S. for a very long time. I mean, anytime anybody brings up edibles,
let's not blame the U.S. on this. There are countries that could drink us under the table.
Of course.
But this is where we primarily
we're not going to talk about the countries where they talk like this and have leprechauns. And I'm just kidding. But yeah, right. But I mean, anytime somebody brings up edibles or marijuana, and it's interesting, Nathan, you could talk better than me at length because you've done a lot of research on this, and especially with your background in agriculture and all that. But the brilliant publicity campaign behind cannabis these days that has completely turned it into something that's, it's very natural, it's very healthy. There's this whole aesthetic that comes along with it now that is just, it's a stunning reversal, because I'm remembering all the way back to a piece like a propaganda film like Reefer Madness that came out, I think, in the 1920s. And we could watch it now and laugh at it, but at the time it was made to scare people, during the Jazz Age. Well, all these kids are just hopped up on that reefer and, look, here's what it's going to do to you. But now no, this is the healthy, viable alternative. People who are holistic and practice mindfulness and go on long hikes. Those are the people who, are advocates of cannabis, even though we could, take a step back and look at, maybe I'm at the risk of bringing in, more complexity into this issue. You can look at places where legalization has happened very quickly, and you can just look at the effect it's had in places like Boulder, for instance, where it's created all sorts of massive challenges. And anyway, it's a far cry from the kind of happy clappy publicity. But what I was saying in larger terms is that addiction has been part of U.S. culture for a long time. Certainly not unique to the U.S. But what's happened now is I think we've got more sophisticated mood control technology than we have ever had in the past. And this is where it's becoming more of an issue. Take something like an edible. An edible is an amazing piece of technology because on the surface, it's quite safe. Certainly a lot safer than hard drugs, but it is a mind-altering psychotropic substance, and it is being used to basically for mood control. It's being used very much like what you see in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. In fact, more and more of us are doing that these days because we're trying to self-regulate all the time because we're experiencing a good deal of meaninglessness and we're experiencing a good deal of despair in our day-to-day lives. And so we're increasingly turning to different technologies. Alcohol is a technology as much as your smartphone is a technology, as much as an edible is a technology. And we're using these to try to control our moods. And we have more control now than we did in the past. That's what I think is happening. I could be wrong. Maybe you need to set me straight, Nathan.
Well, so I think let's just be clear as we're moving forward here that we're talking about two kind of categories and layers at the same time. So one is the dietary scientific health side of what does substance X, Y, and Z do to my liver, brain, whatever. There's a sociological component of what does it do to my relationships and my functionality. But you're pushing us here to think where the conversation always kind of drifts in my mind is, so what's the motivation for the use? So let's just say, hey, it does work. Let's admit that, embrace that up front. You can change your mood by the consumption of a whole variety of things. Hey, fast for 24 hours and see if you aren't a little bit grumpy. Right. You know what I'm saying? Like, so the link between your gut microbiome and your brain function is real. So there's that, but but that might therein lie the question of saying, why am I doing this in the first place? And, good marketing works. Back in the day, you're going to smoke a cigarette. It's going to make you more attractive. But you can go farther back to opium, to the secret ingredient in Coca-Cola. Throughout history,
right?
Like, this is not a new thing. There's always been this desire to explore, and it does come through. It seems like there's this natural progression. So I knew a lot of people, Cameron, way before there was any conversation about cannabis being legal, who could make the claim that it's a natural substance. This is totally healthy. I played soccer. I know. Yeah. So it's like, I knew the people making the argument. I worked with people making the argument. Like, it was like, let's not act like this is a new thing on the face of the planet. But so you start off with like, it's natural and it's healthy. Then the next phase is, and it's good for you medicinally. So, right, that was the cannabis. Medical marijuana was the whole thing. And as soon as you get into the medicinal use, and we see this also going with, I think, psilocybin and psychedelics. So, like, I'll look at the medicinal value. Onward we go from there. So there will be something 2 years from now that somebody comes up with another synthetic compound or discovers another way to. Well, actually, there's a lawsuit about this. I think of somebody trying to patent peyote as a synthetic chemical, and they're same people saying like, well, this is a religiously sacred plant, you can't put a patent on it. So I mean, this will always be a conversation of like, what's next? But you're asking us to think about like, why in the first place. And just before you answer that, I was so Henry David Thoreau, good old Walden back there sitting in the 1840s, would say that all of the great thinkers of the world only drink water. So you have extremists in every direction here of saying, don't sign them up for the cult of Dionysus. So there's always been this extreme of what's most natural, but the motivation part, I think, is helpful that you're bringing that out to us.
Well, and I think I want us to think about this. On the one hand, this is just a very practical way to look at it in terms of long-term and short-term gratification. In the United States now, and that's before I want to move us into the spiritual territory in just a second. But in the United States, I mean, we right now, so many of these technologies are there to give you short-term gratification. And if you just zoom out a little bit, the short-term gratification almost always has a hefty price tag attached to it. So let's just take the practical example I gave earlier. Let's say you've had a bad day and there is a whole bag of Doritos at the end of that day. You're going to enjoy that bag of Doritos because who doesn't? They're going to be great. But in the long run, will you be happy that you consumed a bag of Doritos? Well, no, you won't. But the ability to think long-term versus short-term, even when you've got a serious urge, and let's face it, most of us, unless we take control, are going to be controlled by our bodies. It's one of those basic facts of life. This is, again, why it is. It really is. And I mean, it takes one to know one. I know how hard that is. But once you start making a plan, and to resist these kinds of temptations, it's going to require a plan. And there's a reason why people, we fall into this more. The older we get, the more responsibilities accumulate in our lives, the more stress builds up. And so the temptations are greater to, use food or various substances to control our moods. So you have to have a plan. And these plans have to be designed for you specifically, because you're going to look different than every person. There are certain basic principles, but there's some of these are going to be unique to you and your own personality. But this plan has to be there in place so that you can learn to resist short-term gratification in favor of long-term gratification. And long-term gratification is always going to have more to do with your overall health and your overall wellness. And that's going to include your relationships. That's going to include your quality of life. That's going to include your physical health, all of that. And again, that is a growing trend in our nation right now. Now, I do think that it tends to go in a little bit of a narcissistic direction when it's, happens outside the church. But I think there are some positive aspects to it, and there's some real opportunities for us. But I'll just pause there for right now, Nathan. I think we've got to we've got to work on incorporating strategies to get us to move past short-term gratification to long-term gratification. And that requires intentional planning. It requires, as Dallas Willard says, get your bingo cards ready, vision and intention and means, VIM.
Oh, well, let me jump on this then and throw another Dallas Willard quote in here, because doesn't he say somewhere that there is no problem in life which following Jesus does not solve?
Yes.
Are you familiar with that quote?
Yep. That's right. Yep.
So let's think of it this way. I know some people who have circumstances and situations in life that if I were them and thought, hey, you know what, for $35, I could check out from the situation I'm in right now for a little while. You have to be sympathetic to that. So the escapism is the more miserable you are, the more, alluring the escapism appears to be. The problem is none of that ever actually alleviates anything long term. So there's the long term thing that you're talking about, Cameron, is absolutely right. But you have to have a pre-existing concept that the future can be and or will be better than the present in order to make changes that see that coming to fruition. And so really we're coming
huge.
back into the theme of hope here to say, man, I can see, and I think that's why in addiction recovery, people who are former addicts are so helpful to people who are current addicts, is because there are some situations that people get themselves in life where they really can't see light at the other end of the tunnel. And why not just self-medicate until it's over? Becomes a pretty powerful, particularly once you already get the chemical and the physiological components of addiction in there, a pretty hard nut to crack. So really the antidote to some of this is hope, I think. And so that speaks to that spiritual component there of, do you think that the long-term good is possible? Because that's the prerequisite for making choices that lead in that direction.
It's a very important question. And so here's a sobering thought. If you are in a position where you are consistently overindulging in some category, you are unhappy. That's the cold hard fact that we have to face. And if you get mad at me saying it, don't get mad at me saying it. Get mad at Pascal, because he said it first and he said it better. But he points out very incisively that if we're chasing distractions, he uses the word diversions. So if we're filling our lives with diversions, that is proof that we are in despair. Now, he's totally right. And if there's one thing that could be said about America in large terms as a nation, is that it is a nation struggling seriously with despair. And what you said about the future, Nathan, is so germane right here, because for so many of us, the subject of the future is just brings up dread rather than, expectations and hope and excitement, because there's just this general sense
if you think the future is a boot stomping on human faces for eternity, Soma sounds good.
Right. So Christians think counterculturally, always. One of the ways it shows up in a culture that's experiencing some decline, which we are in the U.S., let's go ahead and admit that, is that Christians are the people who still have hearts filled with great expectations. Now, that's because their hope is predicated on Christ and his kingdom. It'll make you look a little weird. But so, in other words, you're excited about the future, even when everybody else is looking at real estate trends and world events and, oil prices and freaking out. But that's also a measure of how we, just in our day-to-day lives, how your relationship to food is going to reflect what you think about the future. Your relationship to food and the substances around you is going to reflect your sense. Now, you may say, I'm filled with hope. But if you're a functioning alcoholic, you're clearly not filled with hope. And that might be a hard thing to admit. You might be angry to hear that. But if you're angry, there's a good chance it's just true. And that is increasingly the case with so many of us in the U.S. right now.
And we have a biblical command to be sober-minded, I think, for a reason. That there's a somber, not in a long-facedness here. But I think in that realistic, we talk about this all the time, the kind of the optimistic realism or the hopeful realism of saying, having our attention attuned to not just our own way of being, but also to the needs and the situations in the world around us, and having the capacity and the competency to respond to meet those needs requires a clear-mindedness at all times that should be a joyful experience, not something that... So there's a sense in which the Christian perspective is to recognize and to be able to see the brokenness of the world and think that there's something that God wants us to do about it, not something that we need to hide from. And so if we believe that restoration, reconciliation, redemption, and renewal is a part of what God is doing in our lives even now, then that gives us a starting point, I think, to ask some big questions about our practices. And we can look at the scientific data of the outcome of it. Actually, I think we pretty much anecdotally know in a lot of this stuff, but then to really bore in where Cameron has been leading us to think through, why am I doing what I'm doing here? And is this a healthy long-term way to live in the future? Now, hey, I just got back from church retreat. And I loved eating ice cream and Doritos and having a big old time feasting with my fellow believers and playing cornhole and studying scripture together. Like I'm not. I think there's a level of austerity here that is also is also self-centered. And this would be my problem with, I think, a lot of the broader narrative on the health side outside of the spiritual background is that it is a religious form of salvation to say this body is all that I have, and therefore I must do whatever is possible to maximize my longevity. And so I think there's caring for something that is God honoring, and I think there's an obsessive self-focus that is a form of, I think you used the word narcissism early, and self-worship that just makes you miserable. Not because of what you're eating and drinking, you're miserable about what everybody else is eating and drinking. So they're real fun to be around.
You're miserable to be around if you're like that too.
It's kind of like
nobody wants to hang out with you.
If you eat healthy food, you don't live longer. It just seems longer. There could be some truth to that. Anyhow, so I don't want us to be a strong austerity measure being imposed
too dour
here
about it.
Yeah. And I think being self-controlled when you can means you have a freedom when festivity is great when it's a festival. Daily, it's not a festival.
When it's a festival. No, I mean, so let's take fasting, for instance. The spiritual disciplines remember Dallas Willard again, their strategies purposely time tested strategies purposely undertaken to help bring our whole personality into cooperation with Christ. Let's take fasting. Probably the most, when somebody says spiritual disciplines, I think fasting is usually what immediately comes to mind. Well, you don't fast so that you never feast again. That's not what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
You're helping yourself to hear the Lord. You're trying to draw closer to the Lord and listen better. You're learning to be content when you don't have what you want.
Practicing self-control.
But for practicing self-control, but for some of us, this is where I've often said spiritual disciplines, you have to get creative. Some people need to learn how to celebrate. So for some people, feasting a little bit would be a good spiritual discipline. And you're so right to say what you did about some of those health practices that quickly turn into kind of a religion of their own and become legalistic. I mean, tonight, Lord willing, it's really hot here. I'm planning to eat some ice cream with my kids. You know why? Now I could say, well, there are no health benefits to eating this. This is going to take away my gains, man. But my kids they're bothered if I don't eat ice cream with them. Part of their enjoyment is me enjoying it with them. And you know what? So I would rather, plus I like ice cream. I don't eat it every day, all the time, but it's great to sometimes sit down and eat ice cream with your kids. I'm happy to do that. And I don't ever want to be in a world where I wouldn't do that sometimes. So there's a balance here. We don't want to all be just,
yeah. So I think, one last thing here before we wrap this up, Cameron, or maybe get you to say the final wise things, is that I think beginning to use a substance has a lot to do with our motivations as well, particularly around what other people think of us. As we call that peer pressure, right? Of having a lack of confidence and identity means that we're more suggestible to the things that will make us cool. And you and I have had different backgrounds on a variety of different things, but one of the gifts that was really given to me as a young man is there's a guy who is hilarious that everybody who knows him loves him and has smoked his entire life and wishes that he hadn't and has tried every single conceivable thing to not. Who said to me when I was like 9 years old, like just I think maybe put his hand on my shoulder and looked me in the face and said, "I smoke and I hate it and I wish that I couldn't." And the best thing you could possibly do with your life in relation to this is just never start. And he told me that when I was like 9, and I'm, here we are years, decades later, and I still remember that. But that was a gift to me of just having somebody who's like, yeah, your friends are going to tell you it's cool, but it's not. It's miserable, and I hate it. And so I think sometimes, if you've been through something like that, or you're stuck in something like that, and there is a redemptive element when you can take stuff that you've struggled with and use that to really save somebody else some trouble in life. So I think there's, have the confidence to recognize the things that we've wrestled with in the past and say, hey, yeah, I've been a part of this. I hate it. Your best course of action there, young fellow, is don't start in on it. And I think that's a way that we can honor God with some of the past that we've had, regardless of what the issue or the element is there. So just want to throw that out there for you too. If you've wrestled with addiction and
nice.
You'll continue to, but I think also look for ways in which you can use your experience to be a blessing and help to other people can really be something that honors the Lord too. So be of good cheer there and be a mentor in some of these categories, I think would be good.
Yeah. I mean, on a personal note, I had to have that talk early on with I didn't have to. I chose to have that talk early on with my son when he saw a lot of people smoking, was intrigued by it. I told him, yeah, your daddy used to be a dummy and smoke. And he was just, Dad, you did? Yes, I did. Dad, it's really, really bad for you. Yes, it is. And Daddy was very silly and basically told him in so many words the same thing your friend told him. Now, by God's grace, I was able to kick that habit. So, I mean, all that to say also, once again, listeners, you know this. I'm not some sage on a mountaintop descending to talk to you about, you struggle with, no, this, we all struggle with this. And I live in the United States like you do. This is one of the most seductive places on the planet. And so that's why it's so important for us to be honest with ourselves, ask ourselves, what am I hiding from? If I have diversions in my life, What am I hiding from? Why do I not want to face reality? Why am I afraid of reality? And think of those words that Nathan drew our mind to from Peter, sober-minded, vigilance. Peter uses the word vigilance a whole lot. What are we hiding from? And that might be a difficult thought exercise. And at least in my case, it required a lot of prayer, going to the Lord, asking for courage, but also asking him to disabuse me of some of the false notions that I had in my heart and in my head. And
Cameron,
to emerge and look once again at the world. Yeah.
If there's a takeaway from this, now that I'm listening to you wrap this up for us, is that just remember that following Christ gives you the freedom to not follow a lot of other stuff. And I think in a very well marketed consumeristic culture, just know it's okay to say, like, you know what, I don't actually need that in my life, even though I've been told that I do. It's as simple as that. But that's a great gift.
It's not easy to do that.
The truth will set you free.
Yes. And that's, again, a plug for going to church, belonging to a local congregation, having a vital life of prayer, being steeped in the word, so that you are shaped and formed to be able to say, that's not me. No, I don't find that compelling. I'm not interested. Because it takes a lot to do that, especially when everything around you is screaming the opposite message. So we hope this has been helpful to you. Obviously, this is an issue that's far from, we're not just talking about matters of legality. We're not just talking about abstract concepts. This is an episode that gets full on into meddling territory. We're aware of that. So we hope it hasn't been too painful, but that rather it's been a helpful goad to deeper thinking, some good introspection. And as always, thanks for tagging along with us. If you want to talk about this a little bit more, you can do so on TOL Connect. And if you're not part of TOL Connect, we would love for you to join us. For a long time, you've been asking for a discussion forum where we can talk more about the podcast, all the things that Nathan and I left unsaid. Well, you can say them now. For just $5 a month, you can join and lend your voice to the discussion. We would love to have you. And so think about that. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.